The Shepnaz Podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shepnaz Podcast. I'm Joe, and I'm your host today, and we're wrapping up the week by a subject that both Pastor Rob and I enjoy, and that is eating. Is part of the Bless strategy. Leave it to a bunch of pastors to figure out how to work in eating into evangelism. But that is something that is actually very biblical, something that Jesus did and something that we're going to get talking about today. This past week, last week, we were at the M25 conference, so if you haven't caught those episodes, Monday through Wednesday, you can listen to all the pastoral staff talking about the good time we had at M25.
Yep.
And actually, we did cover a little bit of the eating in those podcasts as well, but not the kind of eating we're talking about here.
Yeah, we did do a fair share of eating while we were there, and I guess I knew this, but I didn't really pay attention because I probably didn't listen well. But Kansas City is a big barbecue place, and so we did visit a couple of barbecue places, and I did find some barbecue sauce that I like quite a bit, and brought it back. So looking forward to having some barbecue here.
So on Wednesday's episode, we got into that a little bit, but I don't think we did it full justice of just how much you liked that barbecue sauce.
It was good. I actually collected the leftover from others who had leftover and used it on, I think I put it in my coleslaw.
and fries. You were dipping pickles in it at one point?
We had some pickles, fried pickles or something like that. Yeah, so it was good sauce. So I'll have to.
So today we're talking about eating and using that for evagelism. So how does that work?
Right. So to give the context, we're talking about this strategy, which is we use the word bless, and it's an acronym. The B stands for beginning with prayer, which we've talked about. The L stands for listening, which we talked about yesterday. And the E stands for eating, which we're talking about right now. And you might think, well, how can eating have anything to do with evangelism? But actually, if you look at Jesus' ministry, Jesus did a lot of things that were centered around meals. In fact, in the Gospel of John, the very first miracle that he did was at a wedding, which was a huge feast. It was a week-long feast, and they ran out of wine, and Jesus' mom got him involved, and he turned water into wine. And that was the first miracle that he did. He revealed his identity, that there was something different about him there. He fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, which was actually more than that because that was just the men that were there. At the Last Supper, Jesus used that time to really teach some important truths, got up and washed the disciples' feet, and then gave us the Lord's Supper, which we share together when we do communion. Then even after the resurrection, when Jesus appeared to some of his followers for the first time, it was at breakfast when they were eating on the seashore. He showed up to them. And so in the culture that Jesus lived in, eating was a significant thing for people, and to eat together was really important. If you were to eat a meal with someone in Jesus' culture, it communicated that you were friends, kind of like it is in our culture. You don't really sit down at the table with people you don't know. If you do, it's kind of awkward. So you usually typically eat meals with your friends or family. To eat a meal with someone in Jesus' culture was an opportunity to affirm value to that person. It's like, you're important to me. I want you to know that. And in that culture, you typically ate meals with people who were in the same social class as you, which is kind of something similar to us today. But when Jesus did that, it was very interesting because Jesus was a rabbi. And so he had some social expectations that were placed on him as a rabbi, especially by other Pharisees and stuff. And Jesus, as you know, oftentimes the Bible would talk about Jesus eating with tax collectors who were, not very popular people in their own social class of the day that was rejected by the regular folks, and sinners. In fact, one of Jesus's favorite names of himself was that Jesus was the friend of sinners. And so this happened because Jesus ended up eating meals with tax collectors and sinners, and one of his disciples, Matthew, was a tax collector. And so we see all these kind of places where he did that. But what Jesus was doing when he ate with them was he was identifying with them. He was saying to them, "You're important. You're valuable to me. You matter to me. I identify with you." And I think we would all agree as well that if you share a meal with someone, it it moves you along in your relationship. Like if you sit down with an acquaintance and you have a meal, by the time the meal is over with, you know that person better, partly because of the conversation. And if you're listening, it helps the relationship along as well. And that's that. You know, I talked about this on Sunday. That's what happened for us as a staff. I mean, we work together. We see each other all the time, but most of the time we're in our offices working with different people or whatever. But just to be together the whole time, and then to eat meals together, the conversations that you have, the funny things, the stories that you hear, those are all things that kind of mold you and shape you together. For my family, we try to eat family dinner together on Sundays. It's an important time where we all catch up with each other. We're all living our lives during the week, but on Sundays we sit down together, share a meal, and catch up. And it's a meaningful time. A lot of good and valuable things happen there. And so Henry Nouwen, who, when I went on my sabbatical and I was at the monastery, he wasn't a monk, but he was kind of like a priest, and he's written a lot of books in the Catholic tradition, but he's a really great thinker, and I've got some of his books. But he wrote in one of his books, he says, when we invite friends for a meal, we do much more than offer food for their bodies. We offer friendship, fellowship, good conversation, intimacy, and closeness. And then he goes on and says, when we say, help yourself, take some more, don't be shy, we offer our guests not only our food and drink, but ourselves. A spiritual bond grows and we become food and drink for one another. So like when you're sharing a meal, you're eating something physically and strengthening your body because of the strength of the food. But he says, but when you're together, you're really creating this spiritual bond, and you're nourishing your friendships and your relationships. And so I thought that was really powerful, I think. And I look back over my life, and, you know, I have a lot of things that have happened in my life that have centered on meals, you know, conversations. We do a lot of celebration events that are centered around meals. And so in terms of this strategy, saying, how does having a meal with someone help us? So envision like your neighbor across the street. You've been praying for them. You have conversations here and there, and you listen to see what's going on in their life, and that helps you to know how to pray. And then you say, hey, we'd love to have you guys come over for a meal. You know, just cook out a hamburger in the backyard, sit in the patio or the deck or whatever, or invite them into your house and have a nice meal. If you invite someone into your house to do that, it communicates to them that you love them, you care about them, they're important to you, you want to develop a relationship with them. And then you sit down and you share that food together, which nourishes their body, but then you're sharing your life with each other, which is strengthening your friendship. And as you're having that meal, you're listening to what they have to say, you're getting to know them better, they're getting to know you better. And there's, like Henry Nouwen said, there's that bond that's formed between the two of you. Yeah. And if we're listening as well, we're hearing what's important to them. You talk about what's important. You talk about what's going on in their life, what their needs are, what their struggles are, what their anxieties are. Those become prayer points for you to pray for them. And then, you know, maybe the opportunity comes and they're like, you know, a spiritual conversation occurs. Maybe it doesn't. But I would say that when you invite someone into your home for a meal, you don't have to have this spiritual conversation. Just being with them is what is important. And you're creating the relationship, and there will come a time in their life, if they're not a believer, that they're going to experience something that's going to make them open to that. They're going to recall their relationship with you. You know what's important to you. And they may even come over and say, hey, I need you to pray for me, or this is going on in my life. What do you think I should do, or whatever? And they'll open the door for you to share the gospel. And I just want to be sure that when we think about this strategy, it's okay to have somebody over to your house and not share the gospel. Right.
Dessert does not always have to be the four spiritual laws.
Yeah, and it's like after we've had this meal, I'm like, let me tell you why you're really here. Yeah. You know, God loves you. You're a sinner. You're going to, you don't have to do that. But building that relationship, and then over time, it happens. One of the things that we talked about, and I talked about this at the beginning of this series, is that evangelism is different today than it was. Yeah. We live in a different culture. The context of our culture is very different. And I think, people are further from being accepting of the gospel today because of the culture than maybe they were in the 60s and 70s or whatever. Maybe not. regardless of that, whether it's harder or not, it seems like evangelism takes longer. That was something that was shared at the
it was
conference.
Kevin Jack said, evangelism is not harder; it just takes longer.
Yeah, and I think that's very true. That's hard for a guy. It's hard for somebody who's got a checklist, and I want to win my neighbors to the Lord, check them off, move on to the next one or whatever. And it could take years, but it won't happen unless we're building a relationship, and by sharing a meal is something that's really great to do. In my neighborhood, we have a strange neighborhood. One of our neighbors is a realtor, and she's very. They bring in a food truck once a month in the summer months, and so starting like April, May, June, July, August, September, October, something like that, we'll have a food truck, and it parks right in front of our house, so we can't ignore it. And it's often, sometimes we have things we can't be there, but our neighbors will all show up, and they'll buy food, and they'll sit down in the yard or sit down in just the yards around. Sometimes they buy stuff and but you're standing there for 15, 20 minutes waiting on the food to come, and you're having conversations with the people that you live next to. And it's a weird thing because in a lot of neighborhoods today, you don't know the person who lives right next to you. The person comes home, they push the button on their garage door opener, the door goes up, they drive the car in, the door comes down, and they don't come out. And you don't see each other often. And so to be able to have a neighborhood like that, we're really blessed with that. And what we're trying to do is just through this strategy is create that very thing that's already happening with your neighbors to do that. And so I would just encourage you to think that through. Maybe there's someone that you are praying for and identifying, and we all have names on the board in the lobby here, but we all. God's put you in your neighborhood. You're a light in that neighborhood, and there are people around you who don't know Jesus, and we might be the ones that God wants to use to help them come to know Him. And so just by building that relationship with them can be a big deal. Alan Hirsch wrote a book called Right Here, Right Now, and he's a really great missional thinker. And in this book, he says one of the most sacred practices that we can engage in as believers is to share a meal. And so I would encourage you to just shift your mentality to say sharing a meal with someone is a spiritual thing. Yeah. It was for Jesus, and it is for us. And it doesn't mean you have to share the 4 spiritual laws or the ABCs of the gospel or the Romans road, but sharing your life. And Paul talked about this, and this was a passage of scripture, I think it's in 1 Thessalonians. He says, we love you so much that we're not only willing to share the gospel with you, but our lives as well. And today, I think what happens is we share our lives, and then the gospel gets an open door. For Paul, it was, I'm sharing the gospel, and then I share my life. But today, it's like I'm sharing my life with you, and it leads to an open door to share the gospel. And I think that's a really cool thing. And most of us are good at eating.
Yeah.
You know?
And as you were sharing some of the stories of Jesus, there were definitely miracles. There were times when there were just times of fellowship with the disciples, so people that were already believers. But he did specifically use it as an evangelistic tool. I can remember when he was like, Zacchaeus, I'm going to your house. And that just floored him. I mean, because it would be such an honor that this man would be wanting to have a meal in your home. Yeah. And might not work in our culture to just show up with somebody and say, hey, I'm going to eat dinner at your house today. But in that culture, it was quite an honor for somebody to say, somebody who was getting the kind of attention that Jesus was getting at this point to say, I want to be at your house.
Well, it would be like the president stopping by and say, hey, I would like to have dinner with you.
Right.
You would invite him in probably.
Yeah, it's
most presidents anyway.
It was just amazing to me, and I want to share this quick story. I didn't tell you about this ahead of time, but I really felt the Lord kind of just pushing me there. And there was a time, it's been years ago now, but kind of the impact of meals. And there was a time where, I'll just be transparent and say I was struggling with what my role was in terms of how can I be involved in ministry and feeling a pull to do so much more than what I was doing at the time. And I can remember you and Tim saying, hey, let's go out for a meal. And the three of us, and you've probably forgotten that at this point, but we went out to eat. And during that time, because I was being heard, I was able to come home to Susan and say, you know what, I think good things are coming. And it was, in my mind at the time, really a lot of the things that I'm doing today, but just were not coming to reality at that time. Yeah. And it was just the Lord working those things through. Yeah. But just that meal alone was something that really touched my heart and gave me encouragement at that time. So we never know how those things will impact for the long term and how they actually will, encourage fellow believers. So I guess we'll leave it there today. Yeah. If you're listening to this before lunch, maybe you could call up somebody and take them to lunch, or if you don't have time for that, maybe even just a cup of coffee or something like that, to spend a little time with someone and listen as we were talking about yesterday, and doing a little bit of eating as we're talking about today. Yeah. You can check out everything that's going on in the church by going to shepnaz.org. Also, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. As always, you can email us at podcast@shepnaz.org. For Pastor Rob, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.